welcome to Meet the Press. Our topic today is one that's a hot-button topic in education, inclusion. Inclusion is a topic that sparks much discussion in schools, from what it is, to why we do inclusion, and to how we implement it. Today, our forum will be discussing what needs to happen in schools to make inclusion work. At our Education Roundtable today, graduate students at Clemson University in the Special Education Program. To my right, Lori Zelmer, a general education teacher who also serves as inclusion teacher. To my left, Roz Spitz, a resource teacher who works with inclusion students and also with pull-out moms. And to my next to me, Schneller, special education teacher serving preschoolers. Let's begin with why we're talking about inclusion. My understanding from the special education law is that with the least restrictive environment, we have to have students with disabilities in the general education classroom. So why not just do it and move on to other issues?
Part of that is a little bit of an overstatement. Special education law does require that students with disabilities be provided an appropriate education as close to their non-disabled peers as possible, which is the least restrictive environment. But the key here is that it has to be an appropriate education based on the student's individual needs. So the least restrictive environment is not always the general education classroom. If the student's needs can be met in the general education classroom with supports and modifications and accommodations, then that's certainly what we need to do. But it's very individualized. The law also requires us to provide a continuum of service placements in order to meet the needs of our students. We can't just say we're going to put all students in the general education classroom regardless of their situation. We have to look at individual needs and how and where those needs can best be met.
Yes, full inclusion is pushed for just as a threat of the law, that most likely our students are not being ensured quality individualized education.
And that inclusion is actually worse than no inclusion. Inclusion may meet the letter of the law, but that doesn't mean that it meets the intent of the law. And returning students to the general education classroom without making changes to support them is very irresponsible.
Okay, you said bad inclusion. So presumably there is good inclusion? What differentiates the two?
Well, inclusion has to be based on philosophy and beliefs. You have to involve teachers that believe at the heart every child deserves individualized instruction. And therefore you have to base your inclusion model on students with individualized needs.
There also has to be some buy-in and ownership that goes into the inclusion process and an idea that this is my program and I want to make it work.
And successful inclusion also requires collaboration and program development. You have to have time to meet with a special education teacher and collaborate with her and share ideas.
Okay, two questions from that. First, you talk about buy-in. If inclusion is so good, why isn't everyone doing it? And also, is it special education versus a general education fight?
I think that goes back to kind of the buy-in. It's not really accurate to say it's special ed versus general ed. In fact, here today we've got representatives of regular ed and special ed both, and I think that for the most part, teachers want to do what's right for students. Buy-in is often based on the experiences that you've had, and that goes back to what Lori was talking about. Bad inclusion, it can often do more damage because it sort of sets up those perspectives that when it doesn't work, then it says, oh no, that's not, we can't do that anymore, instead of looking at why it didn't work.
And the problem is often with communication between the general ed and the special ed teachers. And you have to look at developing relationships. You have to have a good relationship with your co-teacher. You have to develop relationships between the students, the parents, the administrators, between school and home, and it has to be a good working relationship in order to work.
And often changes in roles can be uncomfortable for people in the school. Administrators and teachers need to recognize that most often a general education teacher comes with a lot of content knowledge, but a special education teacher comes with strategy knowledge as well as just best practice for students with disabilities.
Okay, so I hear you talking about good inclusion and developing all these programs and all these things. If there are good inclusion programs out there, why not just replicate them for our schools?
Well, part of the process is program development, and it can be, and probably should be, visiting model programs. I know this year at our school we had several other schools from other districts come in and visit, throughout the day, inclusion classrooms, and just to see how things worked and how we made things work and how the administration supported us and things like that.
But at the same time, you can't just take a program and pick up that program and put it in place somewhere else. Because part of what makes the program work are the dynamics and the things that are going on in your school, the kids that are in your school and what those students' needs are. And it's different within a school from year to year, but it's very, very different between schools. And so you really have to personalize an inclusion plan for your school, for your students' needs, and then for where your school is in that inclusion process.
Yeah, I strongly agree with Becky. There has to be a lot of buy-in and ownership of your program and your kids, but you have to want what's best for students for your school.
All of us talk about preparation, program development. For administrators out there, can we wait, until we get our ducks in a row or get the kinks worked out?
Certainly not. You do have to have a plan. You have to be working towards a plan. However, you can't just not serve your students with disabilities. Those children have to be served all along. However, a plan, an inclusion plan, is always evolving. It changes just as the school climate changes, just as the kids come in and the kids change. It's constantly changing.
And you have to go into inclusion knowing that it's work in progress. That's part of where the communication comes in, with administrative support and commitment to the philosophy that it's not going to be perfect. We're going to have to make changes along the way, kind of pick out the things that are good and what's working, and the things that aren't working so good, and kind of tweak those things. But it's definitely a commitment to the philosophy.
We're running low on time, but I want to make sure that we sum everything up, especially for administrators out there who are looking at inclusion and wanting to make it work. So please, in 30 seconds or less, please tell me your most important things about inclusion.
Mine would definitely from the general ed perspective, would be support. There has to be support for teachers as well as the philosophy. There has to be a commitment to make it work, and that commitment has to be conveyed in the school.
And one way to me that commitment is conveyed is that we provide training, and we provide training. It's not just certainly for the teachers, for the special education teachers, for the general education teachers, but we also need to provide training for our students and for our staff members, to some extent maybe even parents and administrators. Part of making inclusion work is making everybody that's involved in the process comfortable and starting to unravel some of the myths that surround both disabilities and students with disabilities, and then also that surround inclusion.
I also believe providing time is very important for teachers. Being a special ed teacher, it's very important for me to have time for regular teachers for planning, for discussion, again, for her to bring her content knowledge, for me to bring my strategy knowledge, but best educates our students with disabilities.
And going back to that, the relationships that are there to begin with, you sort of, when you're making assignments and pairing up and doing some of that, you need to look at relationships and personalities and how things mesh. If you're working with someone whose philosophy you don't jive together, it sort of puts you behind the 8 ball to start with.
Yeah, and in the beginning, you have to recognize the work that's involved in making it work. As far as scheduling can be a big deal, ratios, accommodations, just looking at those things and taking those things into account before you start the model.
And I think certainly it's important to keep in mind you don't just take all of your children with IEPs or students with disabilities and dump them in one regular classroom for them to be served. That's not best practice for students with disabilities nor low achieving students.
Well, I wish we had more time to discuss this important topic, because I do believe it is an important topic. I want to thank all of you for being here today, for sharing your expertise with us, and for Make the Best. I'm Samantha Green. Have a great day.